It's interesting that we call it Good Friday. And we know that it's good because what we should be doing is we should be celebrating the resurrected Jesus all year long. Like that's why we come to church every Sunday that we come to church is because of the resurrected Jesus, because of his victory over death. But the irony of this being Good Friday is that we are currently in what's called the Lenten season. And it's this time that the church collectively embraces the sorrow and the suffering of Jesus and the sorrow and the suffering of all of creation in our current state. And if we think of it like breathing, this is the moment when all of the air comes out of us before we can take a breath back in. When I was younger, my family would go camping with my aunt, my uncle, and my cousins. And I remember one year that we had gone camping at Shaver Lake, and my cousins and I, we were playing in the woods. And, boys don't need much to be entertained. And so we found some boulders, and that was plenty, right? And I remember this because, naturally for boys, this is hours of entertainment. And so there were these two rocks, the two huge boulders that we had found, literally taller than us, so we could climb up on top of them. But there was a gap between the two rocks, almost as if like an earthquake had happened and split a single rock in two. And so my cousin, as we climbed up on top of the rocks, he jumped across the gap to the other rock. Now, I wasn't a risk taker as a kid, but this seemed acceptable. This seemed reasonable. And so I went for it, but what I did is, have you ever thought about jumping and then as you're in the jumping motion, you chicken out? You second guess yourself? Do you know what happens when you do that? You don't jump. And so I got to the edge and I got ready to make this leap and I chickened out and I fell between the crack of the two rocks. And I remember this moment specifically because I remember the panic. I remember freaking out because what happened is when I fell between the two rocks, my back smacked against the first rock and I couldn't breathe. It was the first time in my life I had the wind knocked out of me. And I had no idea what was happening. Like you can imagine, anybody who's in here who's had the wind knocked out of them, you might remember the first time it happened because what in the world is happening? Why can't I gulp the air back in? Now recently, I had the wind knocked out of me again. And this time was different though, because this time I knew that I just needed to wait. I knew that as much as I want to gulp in the air right now, I just need to wait. My body knows what it's doing, and it can handle this. And Good Friday is a time to gaze upon the crucifixion in a way that knocks the wind out of us, and to patiently wait before we gulp the air back in. The air isn't coming until Easter. So for now, we wait. And we sit in the devastating reality. So we're going to spend some time tonight looking at the death of Jesus. And we'll see some different responses to who Jesus is at the cross, to different responses for how different parties view Jesus as he's suffering on that cross. But first, I just wanted to take a moment. And I just want to take a moment to read through the crucifixion. And so if you've got your Bibles, we're going to start in Matthew 27. It'll be on the screens as well. And we're going to spend the majority of this message looking at the back half of the crucifixion when Jesus actually dies on the cross. But before we get there, there's so much suffering that happened to Jesus. And so I just want to take the time to read through it, to not skip over it. And so Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 27. Large section of scripture, but here's what it says. It says, "Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. 'Hail, King of the Jews,' they said. They spit on him, and they took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him away to crucify him. And as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And there they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And sitting down, they kept watch over him there. And above his head, they placed the written charge against him, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking his hand and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and then we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him if he wants him. For he said, "I am the Son of God." In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. I just want to take a moment to let that set in, to let that shape how we think of who this Jesus is, to consider the gravity of this moment. See, I know that I have a tendency to read through the crucifixion quickly because I'm excited to get to the resurrection. We know the resurrection's coming. We want the resurrection. But I think about when Jesus asked his friends as he was in the garden praying, and he asked them, "Couldn't you keep watch for just 1 hour?" And the uniqueness of Jesus is that he is the God who enters into our suffering. I think it's only fair that we take the time to occasionally enter into his. So we take this moment to just meditate on this reality, on what it meant for God to suffer and to die on that cross. Now, as we continue in this, we're continuing in a series that we've been doing for the past few Sundays, where the past few weeks what we've done is we've looked at Jesus according to some different people. We've looked at Jesus according to Judas, and we've looked at Jesus according to the crowds. And tonight is Jesus according to them all. Why them all? Well, the more that I prepared this message, the more that I realized that there are 3 distinct groups that act in response to Jesus while he's on the cross. So let's dive right into our first response. Still in Matthew 27, but starting in verse 45 this time. And it says, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. And about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." And immediately one of them ran and got a sponge, and he filled it with wine vinegar and put it on a staff and offered it to Jesus to drink. And the rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." Now, as Jesus suffered on the cross, many have realized over time that crucifixion, generally those who were crucified, they did not perish from all of the excruciating torture that they faced. There was one of 2 reasons that people often died. One was from shock that the body was put in from all that it went through, and the other was from asphyxiation, from suffocating, because as they hung on the cross, they would have to pull themselves back up against the splintered wood to try to gulp in air again. And eventually, you just can't take it anymore. And so it comes as no surprise to us then that Jesus didn't say much while he was on the cross. But I think what that means is that we have to put that much more work into looking at what he did say. Because the words that he did say hold so much more weight now. And so in this moment, when Jesus cries out from the cross, he cries out this phrase that's partially in Hebrew, partially in Aramaic, and that's why some people are confused and saying he's calling for Elijah. But ultimately, Jesus is crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this is an incredibly intentional quote from Jesus for a few reasons. See, a common Jewish practice was to quote the first verse of a psalm if you wanted to recall the entirety of the psalm to mind. Right? So if you said the first verse, then people, they memorized the psalms. And so they would know exactly where you were going with this, and all of the words of that entire psalm would flood into their minds. And so in this moment, Jesus is calling out. What he's doing, I believe, is partially he's calling out because at the end of Psalm 22, there's a victory. And he's crying out, claiming the victory that he has on the cross. But before we can get to that victory, because that's in a couple days. So for now, we stay in the reality of the crucifixion. And we keep in mind that Jesus wasn't just calling out the end of the psalm, but all of the psalm, which includes the middle. So Psalm 22 is what Jesus quotes. And in Psalm 22, verses 12 through 18, it says this. It says, "Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. And I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments." Now, you might remember there's a story in the gospel accounts. And if you don't remember, that's okay. But there's a story where Jesus is speaking with his disciples, and he asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" And ultimately, at the end of this conversation that they're having, Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail." Okay, so keep that moment in your minds, because I want to show you something, and I hope that I don't lose you in this. But Jesus talked about the strong bulls of Bashan. Okay, so he's made this statement about Bashan, which is the exact same region where Jesus was when he was talking about the gates of hell. Okay? Michael Heiser was a biblical scholar who specialized in ancient history, Semitic languages, and the Hebrew Bible. And here's what Michael Heiser had to say about Bashan in his book, The Unseen Realm. He said, quote, "Bashan carries a lot of theological baggage. It was the Old Testament version of the gates of hell, the gateway to the underworld realm of the dead. It was known as the place of the serpent outside of the Bible. It's associated with Mount Hermon, the place where Jews believed the rebellious sons of God from Genesis 6, 1 through 4 descended. Simply put," here's the part I want you to keep in your minds. "Simply put, if you wanted to conjure up images of the demonic and death, you would refer to Bashan," unquote. Here's why this matters. Everything else in this text immediately makes us think about the crucifixion. We see the piercing of hands and feet. We see the lots that are cast for the garments, all the things that we just read in Matthew 27. But we don't know what to do with the bulls of Bashan. And I don't know if you guys know this, but one of the fundamental beliefs in Christianity is that there are spiritual beings. There is a spiritual reality. And there are these beings, some who are faithful to God and serve God, some who have decided to follow the enemy and are opposed to God. And I know that makes us uncomfortable at times. Sometimes we don't like to talk about that. But the scriptures are clear about these spiritual beings. And everything about the bulls of Bashan is communicating these spiritual forces that are aligned with the Satan. And so, who is Jesus? Jesus according to the demonic beings in this moment, Jesus is defeated. They are gloating over him. They are mocking him from the cross. See, we have this tendency to forget that the spiritual realm and the physical realm are often mirroring each other in many ways. And so we think about how the crowds and the Roman soldiers are actively mocking Jesus while he hangs on that cross. But I think that we need to be reminded that as Jesus was hanging on the cross, he could also see all of the demonic forces that were laughing at him and mocking him along with the Jews and the Romans. And I absolutely don't think that we are as tuned into the spiritual realm as Jesus is. But I think we can get this to some degree. Have you ever been at a place in your life where it's almost like you have someone reminding you, almost like there's a voice whispering in your ear that you are worthless, that you're not good enough, that your efforts aren't worth it, that you shouldn't have tried in the first place? There is a genuine and a real spiritual darkness that kicks you when you're down. There are spiritual entities who hate you just like they hated Jesus. And this is a moment when we are reminded that Jesus went through it too. There is nothing that Jesus cannot empathize with alongside us. In his most desperate moment, he was mocked by the guards, by the crowds, and by the spiritual beings. And yet, almost as if it is in response to all of this mocking, creation itself cries out in retaliation. Look what happens when we keep going in Matthew 27. Again, we'll read verse 45 and then jump down to verse 50. And again, from noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth shook and the rocks split and tombs broke open. And the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. And they came out of their tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. See, this is one of those moments where I'm reminded of Pastor Kevin, because he's told us a few times that we don't need to make the Bible weird because it's weird enough on its own, right? It's got that handled. But I think that there's something really important happening here. The very cosmos, the creation itself, seems to be torn apart by the death of its creator. Creation is entering into the space of mourning that its creator is perishing. The sun hides as the God who told it to shine dies. The earth quakes as the God who holds all things together perishes. And in some crazy way, the graves spew out their dead almost as if they are repulsed by the God of life entering into death. I think that the prophet Amos captured this moment really, really well, though long before it ever happened. In Amos chapter 8, verses 9 and 10, he writes, "In that day declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious festivals into mourning and all your singing into weeping. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day." Our passage in Matthew literally began with the sun going dark at noon, just as Amos prophesied. And as the religious leaders celebrated this moment of victory, the very creation cried out in sorrow and anguish. And this is because, according to the cosmos, according to creation, Jesus is creator and sustainer. And as his life-animating spirit leaves his body, creation itself responds almost as if afflicted with a death blow itself. It was in Luke chapter 19, if you recall, that Jesus was entering into Jerusalem. And knowing that he was heading for his death, and at the same time the crowds are cheering and chanting Hosanna. This is what we just celebrated at the start of this week. And in Luke's account, the Pharisees rebuked Jesus and basically said, "Tell your followers to silence themselves. Tell them to shut up. We don't want to hear this." And Jesus says in Luke 19:40, I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. And it is now, in this moment, that the worshipers of Jesus have fallen silent, and the rocks themselves are crying out, just as Jesus said. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the fact that we want to move quickly out of this moment of suffering, but creation itself thought that Jesus was worth suffering along. If the rocks get it, how much more should we? And here's the interesting thing. See, the sting that the very God who holds all things together, that he briefly let go, that he might be able to retrieve you and I from the clutches of death, that sting of that death that he faced, the feeling and the weight of that we should be able to go through, the creation itself went through. In this moment, it was not creation alone that shuddered at the reality of the death of Jesus. In fact, it included some of the very people who crucified him. Look at this in verse 54. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Listen, as if this statement isn't shocking enough all by itself, this also shows the stark contrast between the Roman soldiers and the Jews. It was just a few verses back that the crowds mocked Jesus and said that if he truly is the Son of God, then he should be able to bring himself down from the cross. And now it's the Romans who are saying that this truly is the Son of God. The irony of this moment is palpable. It's a Gentile soldier, the one who is actively participating in the crucifixion of Jesus, who reclaims the title of Son of God back from that seat of mockery. And we can imagine that there's something that's already been going on in the minds and the hearts of the Roman soldiers. Because Matthew tells us it's not just one soldier. Matthew tells us it's a group of soldiers. See, in Luke's gospel, the implications are very high that the person who offered Jesus the wine and the vinegar drink was one of the Roman soldiers. It wasn't just a person from the crowd, it was one of the Roman soldiers. This was one of the traditional drinks that Roman soldiers would have had on hand for themselves to enjoy. And though the soldier was in the midst of mocking, he also offered his wine and vinegar drink, some of his own drink. Church, this is an act of kindness and mercy. And let me ask you, when does someone show kindness to someone they are actively torturing? They don't. This is bizarre, and it should stand out as bizarre in our minds. And it makes you wonder what is going on in the hearts and the minds of these soldiers leading up to this moment. It's as if the Spirit of God has already met them and is actively convicting them and moving things in their souls and in their minds that there is indeed something very unique about this man, Jesus. And then all of this culminates in the statement that surely this man is the Son of God. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're professing saving faith in Jesus. However, this may actually be the most shocking statement that a Roman soldier could have made. Son of God was a normal Roman phrase because they believed that the kings and the emperors, they were partners with the divine. There was a special bond between the gods and the emperor. And so for that reason, they would call the emperor the Son of God. The emperor himself was divine. Augustus Caesar claimed the title Divi Filius, Phileus, or in English, the Son of God. This was a phrase used exclusively for the emperor. No one else got to share this title. So do you see the implications yet? The implication is that there can only be one. There can only be one. And so if the Roman soldiers are claiming that Jesus is the Son of God, then they are saying that Caesar is not. That's high treason. That's grounds for death. And Matthew says it's a group of soldiers. Church, this is huge. This doesn't happen unless it's literally an act of God. While the Jews used the Roman authority to crucify Jesus, the Roman authorities were forced to acknowledge Jesus as who he truly is because of the authority that he has. Look at this quote from Daniel Zacharias. He says, quote, "This declaration at the cross forms a bookend with a trial scene. And from the spiritual vantage point, the words are an admission of the Roman soldiers' defeat, as the supernatural events demonstrate the enormous power at Jesus' disposal, and they concede their defeat in the face of this superior force. In recognizing the error of their ways, they acknowledge that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not." Unquote. So who is Jesus according to the Roman soldiers? He's the Son of God. They saw him clearly for who he was. And it is now in this moment that Jesus is using these Gentiles, these men who worshiped other gods, these men who crucified this God, Jesus. Jesus is using them right now to reveal to us in here who he is, the weight of who he is. You know, if we were to take a step back for a moment, we've hopefully been seeing throughout this series just how much Jesus is. That there are a million different ways that we could define him and we would still never capture who he truly is. Hopefully we've been seeing that he is simply beyond all categories. And so, right now, today, who is Jesus to us? Who is Jesus to you? See, I would hope that we see and understand that Jesus is the God who suffers on our behalf. The cross should never have happened. Like I still, as a logical person, as somebody who just wants everything to make sense, it doesn't make sense. I know how broken I am. I know how jacked up I am. I look at other people and I think sometimes about how awful other people are, and then I look at myself and I'm offended by who I am. And God would die. God would not just die, he would suffer for me. I simply can't reconcile it. That this God of the universe would see me and choose to become mortal so that he might die for my sake. You can probably think of a million times in your life when you felt like you weren't worth it. Where you felt like someone was convinced you're worth the whips ripping the flesh off of his back. You're worth the thorns digging into his skull. You're worth the nails piercing through his hands and his feet. You're worth the cross splintering into his exposed back. You're worth the demonic mockery. You're worth the rejection by his own people. You're worth it all. And yet somehow, it has nothing to do with you at all. You're worth it all. And yet somehow it has nothing to do with you at all. You're worth it because you're made in his image. You're worth it because he decided to make you, because he decided to love you, because he looked out and he said, I want that one. That one's mine. What does his love for you look like? Looks like the cross. We cannot get to the resurrection without the cross. So I want to urge you this Good Friday not to jump to Sunday. Sit in Friday. Feel it for what it is. In a moment, we're going to receive communion to remember the breaking of Jesus' body and the pouring out of his blood. And as we receive communion this time, it's going to be a little bit different. As you guys will get dismissed to come to the front to receive communion, you will break off a piece of bread, remembering that you have a part in the breaking of Jesus' body. And then after communion, we're going to ask you to fast, to spend Saturday fasting. We have guides for you on the way out, so that if you have questions about fasting, we know that this is new for some of you. Drink water. That's important. Don't fast without water. But we're going to ask you to fast because it's a moment, it's a means, it's an opportunity to say, Jesus, this year I want to, even if it's some just infinitesimal way, to enter into suffering alongside you, to not let go of this moment too quickly. So use tomorrow as a means to suffer alongside Jesus, so that when Easter does come, we can celebrate all the more. But today, tonight, and for all of tomorrow, gaze at the cross in all of its gruesome beauty. Let's pray. Jesus, this is a moment where words fail us. And so we come to you just bearing the weight of all of the feelings, all of the mixed up thoughts that we have considering your crucifixion, considering why in the world you would die on our behalf, considering why you would suffer for us, why you would bleed and why you would die for someone as broken as me. And yet, Jesus, I pray for this whole church, but starting with me, would you not allow me to look away from the cross until it's time? That I would spend this time as if the wind had been knocked out of me and patiently wait before it's time to gulp in air again. That we would see your crucifixion, that we would see you for who you really are. There is no resurrection without your death, Jesus. And your death tells the story of this God who is so deeply in love with us. And may that love transform us. And so we give ourselves to you tonight, Jesus. And we simply pray, do what you will. Do what you will. It's in your perfect name we pray, Jesus. Amen.